1987 Riverwood, Washington. The town of Riverwood always smelled damp. Not the good kind of damp, the kind that reminds you of wet wood and earth. This was a gray, heavy, suffocating dampness, as if the air itself was tired of the secrets hidden beneath the rotting leaves. Alexander Matson, a 47-year-old man with prematurely white hair, knew that smell like an unwelcome guest. He sat in his small, old shop, surrounded by rows of broken clocks, working on a brass pocket watch. The sound of his tools echoed in the silence, like the ticking of a time bomb. Upstairs, in their small apartment above the shop, his 15-year-old son, Joshua, was making a racket. Josh was a quiet kid, but lately, something was stirring in him, a teenager's curiosity. "Dad," Joshua's voice called from above. "What is this?" Alexander pulled his eye away from the magnifying lens. "What are you talking about, Josh? Don't take anything out of the closet." It was a gray Wednesday. Around 5 p.m., Alexander always went out for hot coffee. But today, he couldn't shake the sounds coming from upstairs. The wooden stairs creaked under Joshua's feet. He came down carrying a faded, dusty old cardboard box. "This was in your old clothes closet. It was locked." Joshua placed the box on the counter. It smelled of mildew and age. Without looking up, Alexander said, "Must have been your mother's. Put it back." But Joshua didn't listen. He opened it. Inside was a mess of old letters, faded photos, and a Sony cassette recorder. One of those big ones that took 4 batteries. Next to it was a small black cassette tape. "You remember saying Mom loved to record things?" Joshua asked, his voice filled with excitement. Alexander glanced over for just a second. His heart turned to stone. Caroline, his wife, 12 years ago. A case that was never really closed. No body was ever found. The police called the fall an accident. But Alexander, he never believed it. "That's the one." Alexander's voice was raspy. "Put it away." But Joshua wasn't listening anymore. He pulled out the recorder, slid the cassette in, and pressed play. A harsh, static hiss filled the quiet shop. Alexander held his breath. At first, there was only the grating static. Then, the sound of a woman's heavy, rapid breathing filled the air. It wasn't Caroline's voice, or if it was so distorted by fear that Alexander couldn't be sure. The woman's voice was shaky, muffled. The light's gone. I can't see anything, just a shadow." Alexander moved closer to the recorder, his face as cold and blank as the old clocks in the window. Joshua was frozen in place. The woman's voice, now thick with terror, continued. "It's not here. It shouldn't be here. This isn't what we were supposed to find." Then, her fear spiked as she mentioned another sound, something that seemed to be flying through the air, like the cawing of a crow. Her ragged breathing turned into sobs, and in that moment Alexander knew. It was Caroline. That familiar, chilling tone of fear shattered 12 years of silence. Then, Caroline's scream ripped through the speaker. "Get back. Don't come near me. I recorded everything. Everything." The sound of running feet. Then another scream, short, muffled, and cut off, as if a hand had been clamped over her mouth. Then, the silence on the tape was broken again, not by a voice, but by a heavy, sickening thud, like something hard hitting something soft, followed by the ugly, final hiss of the tape running out. Joshua hit the stop button. His hands were shaking. "Dad, that was Mom's voice." Alexander just stared at the recorder. 12 years ago, the police said Caroline fell from a bridge. But this was the sound of a struggle, the sound of fear, the sound of a murder. With a voice that was barely a whisper, Alexander said, "Yes, Josh, that was your mother." The watch on Alexander's desk suddenly started ticking, and in that moment, Alexander knew the case that was closed 12 years ago was just beginning. He ejected the tape, clenching it in his fist. This wasn't just an old recording. It was a confession, confession to a murder hidden in the heart of Riverwood. The final thud on the tape still rang in his ears. Alexander whispered to himself. It wasn't an accident. It was a killer. Then his eyes fell back to the old box. Underneath where the recorder had been was a folded piece of paper they hadn't seen before. In Caroline's handwriting, 2 words were scribbled. Lara knows. The name hit him like a spark in a dark tunnel. Lara, the retired detective who had been suspicious of the case from the start. He knew he had to find her. He had to understand what Caroline recorded before she died, and more importantly, who that crow was. The shop no longer smelled of brewing coffee, only dust, fear, and the dried blood of time. The night in Riverwood had just begun. Alexander held the cassette in a death grip, as if he could physically choke the scream and that final, sickening thud into silence forever. Joshua stood beside him, still staring at the mouth of the tape recorder, like he expected his mother's voice to speak again. Lara. Alexander whispered the name. Who's Lara, Dad? Joshua asked. A detective, Alexander said, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. The one who handled your mother's case 12 years ago. She wasn't like the others. She always had her doubts. Sleep didn't come for Alexander that night. In fact, he hadn't really slept in 12 years, but this was different. This time wasn't a nightmare keeping him awake. It was a horrifying reality. The next morning, the first thing he did was close the shop. He slapped a handwritten sign in bold letters on the glass door. Closed. Return unknown. An uneasy silence hung between Alexander and Joshua as they drove the old car down the foggy roads of Riverwood. Their destination wasn't the police department. It was the private home of Lara Reed. According to old notes, after retiring, Lara had moved to the edge of the forest, into a remote, old wooden cabin. When they finally arrived, they saw it, a simple, slightly weathered cabin, peeking out from between the pine trees. Alexander knocked on the door. A few seconds later it opened. A woman in her late 50s, with short gray hair and eyes that were tired but razor-sharp, stood in the doorway. Her clothes were simple, comfortable, but her gaze was that of an old-school detective, the kind who missed nothing. Alexander Matson? Lara asked, her voice dry and completely unsurprised, as if she'd been waiting 12 years for this very moment. Hello, Lara. I need to talk to you about Caroline, Alexander said, gesturing to Joshua, who stood behind him. Lara just nodded and invited them in. Her home was filled with old books, stacked paper files, and faded photographs. In the middle of the living room table, a large map of Riverwood was spread out, covered in red marker circles and erratic lines. Without any introduction, Alexander tossed the cassette onto the table. My son found this. It's Caroline's voice. Lara picked up the cassette with one hand. Not rushed, not excited. Just calm, as if she knew this moment would eventually come. She walked over to an old player in the corner of the room and slid the tape in. The same static hiss. Then Caroline's ragged breaths filled the small cabin. The woman on the tape was terrified, talking about darkness, about the light being gone. Lara didn't even blink. When the recorded voice said, filled with dread, I can't see anything, just a shadow. Lara slowly nodded her head. The moment the scream was cut short, followed by that heavy thud. Joshua clapped his hands over his ears. Lara stopped the machine. The silence was so heavy you could hear your own breathing. Caroline recorded this right before. Whatever happened to her? Alexander's voice was strained. The police said it was an accident, but that's the sound of a murder, Lara. Instead of answering, Lara stood up and walked over to the large map on the table. I know. I've known since day one. She picked up a pen and drew a large red circle around a specific point on the map. You said Caroline fell from the bridge, but before she disappeared, she was coming here, to an old place, an underground bunker. Alexander stared at the spot Lara had marked, a point deep in the forest he never would have imagined. What nobody knew was that Caroline was involved in something much bigger, a group. Lara continued. They were looking for an object, an ancient artifact buried somewhere in this cursed town. For the first time, she showed Alexander what his wife had been caught up in. Lara placed her finger on an old photo pinned to the corner of the map, a picture of a stone symbol shaped like a crow. "This is their mark," Lara said. When Caroline disappeared, all the evidence tied to this group vanished with her. "I lost the case, but now we have this tape." But Caroline wrote on the paper. "Lara knows." Alexander pressed. Lara gave a bitter smile. "Lara knows half of it. Caroline had discovered the other half. Now we have to put the two pieces together." Just then, a faint sound came from outside the cabin, the snap of a twig. Joshua, who had been standing silently, whipped his head toward the window. Lara's head snapped around, her detective's gaze instantly shifting to a defensive one. "Who's out there?" she whispered. The dim forest light suddenly flickered. From behind the trees, a tall, slender shadow emerged. It looked human, but on its face was a sleek, black mask, shaped like a crow. The crow Caroline had mentioned on the tape. The shadow stood still, as if it knew they were inside, knew they had heard Caroline's final words. The crow had come back to silence the rest of them. Lara's hand shot under the table and came back holding a .38 revolver. Alexander looked at Joshua in horror. In a single instant, they had gone from revisiting a cold case to being thrown into the middle of a war zone. The crow mask was black, sleek, and terrifying, like a silent monster emerging from the mist. It took one step toward the cabin. "Stay back," Lara yelled. Her voice was no longer tired. It was hard as iron. She aimed her revolver at the window. Alexander pulled Joshua tight behind him, his heart pounding in his throat. This wasn't a 12-year-old mystery anymore. This was a real, immediate threat. The crow stopped. Its hands appeared empty, but the stare from behind the mask felt heavy, menacing. It followed the sound of the tape. Joshua whispered in terror. "It doesn't want anyone to hear it." "That's why I'm not letting it get any closer," Lara said, her finger trembling on the trigger. Suddenly, with shocking speed, the crow sprinted toward the door. Lara didn't have time to take proper aim. She fired. The gunshot exploded through the forest's silence like a bomb. The nearest window shattered, spraying glass across the floor. But the crow didn't stop. It dove through the broken window, right through the hole Lara's bullet had made, moving like a trained predator. Lara scrambled to turn the gun on it. "Get in the basement," she screamed. Without thinking, Alexander and Joshua scrambled for the old basement hatch in the corner of the hall. Alexander yanked the wooden door open and shoved Joshua inside. In that instant, the crow reached Lara. There was a heavy thud. Lara cried out, and her gun flew from her hand, skittering across the wooden floor. Without a word, the crow slammed her against the wall with savage force. Alexander didn't have time to hide. He turned back, just in time to see the crow stoop down and pull something from its belt, a large knife with a sharp, black blade that glinted in the dim light. Alexander had only a second, acting on pure instinct. He grabbed a heavy vase from a nearby table and hurled it with all his strength at the crow's head. The vase struck its shoulder. The crow staggered back slightly. It turned its head and fixed a gaze on Alexander that he could feel in his soul. He felt like he was being stared down by death itself. That moment was all Alexander needed. He jumped into the basement hatch, slamming the door shut with all his might. He threw the wooden latch and braced it with the heavy old box. "Quick, we have to get out of here." Alexander gasped for breath. The basement was dark, lit only by a faint glow from a small ventilation grate. Joshua was terrified, but trying to stay strong. "What about Lara?" he asked. Heavy banging started from directly above them. The crow was trying to break through the hatch. "Lara can handle herself. We have to go. This is how we save her too." Alexander lied. He knew he'd left her, but he had no choice. Saving Joshua was all that mattered. He looked around. The basement was packed with organized boxes and neatly filed cases. This wasn't just a cellar, it was Lara's real office. In the dark, Alexander moved toward an old wooden cabinet. A label on it read, "Riverwood Cases, Unsolved." The pounding from above grew louder. The wooden latch was starting to splinter. "We have to find another way out, Josh." Alexander threw the cabinet open. It was full of yellowed files. He scanned them frantically, looking for anything related to the spot on Lara's map. Suddenly, his eyes caught something. A thick folder labeled Project Echo, and underneath, in bold letters, "Top Secret, Military Involvement." He ripped the folder out and saw it behind the cabinet. A concrete protrusion, a small, round metal door, perfectly concealed. Alexander found a key hidden on the ledge. Lara had a secret escape route. Just as he was turning the key, the hatch above them shattered with the terrifying crash. Splinters of wood rained down into the basement. The crow stood in the opening. It stared down at them for just a moment, the same black mask, emotionless. It looked unbeatable. Without taking his eyes off the crow, Alexander wrenched the metal door open and pushed Joshua through. "Go, Josh," he roared. Alexander threw himself into the tunnel after him. Just before he slammed the heavy door shut, he saw the crow dropping down from the hole. A large, dark stain was spreading across its chest. It was wounded, but hadn't stopped. The metal door clanged shut. Heavy blows began to rain down on it from the other side, but this door was solid. Alexander and Joshua were trapped in a dark tunnel. Alexander clutched the Project Echo file in his hand. They had escaped, but now they were lost in an unknown maze, hunted by a silent, relentless killer. Their only clue was a top-secret file. Alexander knew. Lara had bought them these few minutes with her life. Now, they were alone in the heart of the night.
It's all about humanity.